Dr. Xavier Coleman adjusted his tie in the faculty lounge, his reflection staring back at him through the glass. The morning sun cut through the window, casting sharp lines across the empty room. Today was his first day as a professor at Stanford Heights University, a prestigious institution known for its legacy, its traditions, and something he had quickly come to understand: its unwritten rules. He took a deep breath, straightened his posture, and grabbed his leather briefcase. Whatever awaited him beyond that door, he was ready. At least, that's what he told himself. The walk to Lecture Hall B203 was quiet, almost deceivingly peaceful. But the moment he pushed open the door, he felt it. That subtle shift in energy, the kind that didn't need words to be understood. The noise in the room dropped, not completely, but just enough to be noticeable. 30 pairs of eyes turned toward him. Some were curious, others indifferent, a few assessing. He walked to the podium, placed his laptop down, and faced them with a calm, unwavering expression. "Good morning," he said, his voice even but firm. "I'm Dr. Coleman, and this is your introduction to political theory." A few students exchanged glances, some whispering under their breath. And then, from the third row, a voice, smooth, confident, laced with something just shy of amusement. "Professor Coleman, huh? Thought you'd be older." A few chuckles rippled through the room. Xavier didn't need to look to know who had spoken. He had done his research. He knew exactly who he was dealing with. Blake Holloway. The name carried weight at Stanford Heights. Son of a wealthy donor, captain of the debate team, a senior who walked through these halls like he owned them. And in some ways, he did. His father's name was etched into buildings across campus. People listened when he spoke, and when he didn't like someone, well, that person didn't last long. Xavier met Blake's gaze, unfazed. "I'd say you'll get used to it," he replied smoothly. "But this class isn't about me. It's about the material. So let's begin." The smirk on Blake's face faltered, just for a second. But that was enough. Xavier clicked to the first slide, and just like that, the moment passed. The laughter faded, and the room settled into silence. At least for now. The first half of the lecture went smoothly. Xavier laid out the syllabus, covered expectations, and introduced the foundations of democracy. Most students followed along, nodding, taking notes. But then came the small disruptions. A whisper here, a stifled laugh there. Nothing obvious, nothing that could technically be called disrespectful. But Xavier had been teaching long enough to recognize the signs. He glanced toward the back row. Blake and his group, feet up on the chairs in front of them, barely pretending to listen. For now, he let it go. "All right," Xavier said, closing his laptop. "Let's talk about Plato's Republic. How does Plato describe justice in an ideal society?" Silence. Some students shifted uncomfortably. Then, from the back, Blake's voice cut through the room, dripping with casual arrogance. "Depends. Are we talking about actual justice, or just what people like to hear?" More chuckles. Xavier leaned against the desk, studying him. "That's an interesting distinction," he mused. "Are you suggesting that people only believe in justice when it benefits them?" Blake's smirk wavered. Not much, but enough for Xavier to see it. For a brief second, he seemed to consider his next words. Then, with a casual shrug, he said, "Just saying, some people get the job before they earn it." The room tensed. The meaning was clear. Xavier's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. This wasn't the first time someone had questioned his presence. It wouldn't be the last. "Merit," Xavier said, his voice even. "That's an old debate. Maybe one we should explore in next week's reading." Blake's smirk returned, but there was something different now. Something uncertain. He sat up just a little straighter. By the time class ended, students shuffled out, some giving Xavier polite nods, others avoiding eye contact altogether. As he packed his things, a voice spoke from the doorway. "Dr. Coleman?" He turned. A young woman stood there, clutching a notebook to her chest. "Olivia Tran." "Yes. I just want to say, I thought the way you handled that was cool." He smiled. "Thanks, Olivia. See you next class." She nodded and left. Xavier exhaled, rolling his shoulders. It wasn't the first time he had been tested. It wouldn't be the last. But something told him this was only the beginning. Dr. Xavier Coleman pushed open the door to Lecture Hall B203, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to pause. The hum of conversation dropped, not entirely, but just enough for the shift in energy to be noticeable. 30 pairs of eyes turned toward him, some filled with curiosity, some indifferent, and others assessing. Xavier kept his expression calm as he strode toward the podium, setting down his leather briefcase and opening his laptop. He had been here before, not this classroom, not this university, but this moment. The unspoken test. A new professor, a young professor, and a black professor at that. He adjusted his sleeves, scanned the room, and finally spoke, his voice even and firm. "Good morning. I'm Dr. Coleman, and this is your introduction to political theory." A murmur rippled through the students. A few whispered to each other, exchanging knowing glances. And then, from the third row, a voice, smooth, confident, just loud enough to command attention. "Professor Coleman, huh?" The speaker leaned back in his seat, stretching his long arms over his head before crossing them casually over his chest. His smirk was deliberate, practiced, like a man used to getting reactions. "I thought you'd be older." A few chuckles. Nothing loud, nothing disruptive, but enough. Xavier met his gaze without hesitation. He knew that face, even if this was their first time speaking. Blake Holloway, son of a wealthy donor, captain of the debate team, and one of the most influential seniors on campus. He was the kind of student who wasn't just respected, he was feared. Professors tolerated him because they had to. Administrators looked the other way because of his father's money and influence. Xavier had read about him before stepping into this classroom, and now Blake was studying him too, measuring him. Xavier allowed the silence to stretch just long enough for the weight of the moment to settle. "I'd say you'll get used to it," he replied, his voice smooth. "But this class isn't about me. It's about the material. So let's begin." Blake's smirk flickered, but only for a second. The moment passed. Xavier clicked to the first slide, and the class moved forward. For now, the first few days passed without major incident. Xavier taught his lessons, assigned readings, and led discussions. Most students engaged, some genuinely interested, others simply doing what was required. But there was something else, a shift in the air. Little things, barely noticeable if you weren't looking. The whispers, always just low enough that he couldn't make out the words. The stifled laughs, passed between students with careful glances. The way certain students, always the same ones, would lean back in their seats, arms folded, smirking just enough to show they weren't really listening. It was calculated, subtle, deliberate. He knew exactly who was behind it. By Friday, it escalated. Xavier walked in a lecture hall, B203, with his usual routine. Briefcase in one hand, coffee in the other. Some students were already seated, flipping through notes or scrolling through their phones. He reached the podium, opened his laptop, and froze. Something wasn't right. The screen wasn't showing his carefully structured slides on John Locke and the social contract. Instead, an altered image filled the screen. His own face, photoshopped onto the body of a janitor, a mop in hand, standing in a dimly lit hallway. For a brief second, silence. Then laughter erupted, loud, mocking from the back row. Xavier's jaw tightened, but his face remained neutral. He knew better than to react impulsively. Instead, he let his gaze sweep across the room, settling on the one person who wasn't laughing, but smirking. Blake leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, amused. "Professor," he called out, feigning curiosity, "is this today's lesson? Didn't realize we were covering workplace hierarchy." More laughter. A few students exchanged nervous glances, sensing the tension thickening in the air. For a moment, Xavier considered his options. He could report the incident to campus IT, have them trace whoever accessed his slides. He could demand answers, threaten academic consequences. But that's exactly what they wanted, a reaction, a scene, something they could twist into a joke, make him look oversensitive, like he couldn't handle a little fun. He wouldn't give them that. Instead, Xavier took a deep breath, calmly unplugged the projector, and turned back to the class as if nothing had happened. "Interesting choice of imagery," he mused. "I just hope whoever made this put half as much effort into their essay on Hobbes." The room fell silent. A few students exchanged uncertain glances. The laughter died down, replaced by something different. Blake's smirk faltered. Xavier tapped his laptop once, and within seconds his reel slides reappeared on the screen. He turned back to the class, his expression unchanged. "Now," he said, voice even, "let's begin." Blake sat up straighter. He hadn't expected that, but this was only the beginning. Xavier walked across campus early Monday morning, the crisp autumn air sharp against his skin. He had planned to spend the morning preparing for class, refining his lecture, and reviewing student submissions. But as he reached his office, his steps slowed. Something was wrong. The door. The smooth wooden surface was now smeared with thick, red marker, the letters jagged and aggressive, as if written in a rush, but with undeniable intent. Fraud. Unqualified. Go back where you belong. Xavier exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. He scanned the hallway. Empty. Whoever had done this had made sure no one was around to witness it. He clenched his fists, then forced himself to relax. This was what they wanted. A reaction. Outrage. A confrontation. A scene. Instead, he pulled out his phone, snapped a photo, and calmly walked away. 10 minutes later, campus security arrived. The officer, a stocky man with thinning hair, scratched his chin as he looked over the vandalism. "Probably just some dumb kids messing around," he muttered, his voice indifferent. "You want us to file a report?" Xavier studied the officer's face. There was no urgency, no real concern. "Yes," he said, his tone sharp but controlled. "And I want a copy for my records." The officer shrugged. "Sure thing, Professor." As the officer walked away, Xavier leaned against his desk, staring at the words still fresh on his door. They wanted him gone. That much was clear, but he wasn't going anywhere. By Tuesday, the hostility had become undeniable. The classroom had turned into a battlefield, not of words, not of ideas, but of silent defiance. It started with small things. Blake and his group would sit in the back row, lounging in their seats, feet up on the chairs, smirking like they had nothing better to do. They barely pretended to take notes. Instead, they exchanged whispers, passing remarks just loud enough for others to hear, but never quite enough to be called out. Then came the yawning. It was subtle at first. Blake stretched dramatically in his seat, letting out an exaggerated sigh. "Sorry, Professor. Just trying to stay awake." A few chuckles. Xavier ignored it. Then another student did the same. Then another. Within seconds, half the back row was mocking him, yawning, stretching, shaking their heads like the lecture was unbearable. Xavier closed his laptop. The room went silent. He walked slowly around his desk, scanning the room before stopping in front of Blake. "You bore, Mr. Holloway." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now. Blake shrugged, his usual smirk still in place. "Just saying, some professors know how to keep a class engaged." Xavier nodded, his expression unreadable. "That's fair," he said simply. Then he turned to the rest of the class. "Anyone here who wants to leave, go ahead. Right now. No penalty." No one moved. A few students exchanged uncertain glances. One girl shifted in her seat as if considering it. But not a single person stood up. Xavier looked back at Blake. "Looks like engagement isn't the issue, is it?" Blake's smirk slipped, just for a second. Xavier turned and walked back to the podium. "Now let's continue." The games were over, but the real fight hadn't even begun. By Wednesday morning, Xavier thought he had seen it all. The whispers, the vandalism, the classroom antics. But nothing could have prepared him for what happened next. His phone buzzed. A new email. Subject: Urgent complaint, Dr. Xavier Coleman. His stomach tightened. He clicked it open. "Dear Dr. Wright, it has come to our attention that Dr. Xavier Coleman has been engaging in unprofessional behavior, showing clear bias towards certain students, and failing to maintain a fair academic environment. Several students have expressed concerns about his ability to conduct himself appropriately as a professor. We urge the administration to investigate these claims." The message was unsigned, but Xavier wasn't an idiot. Less than an hour later, he sat across from Dr. Ellen Wright, the department head. She tapped a pen against her desk as she skimmed the complaint. "These are serious accusations," she said finally, setting the paper down. Xavier folded his hands. And they're completely false. Dr. Wright sighed, rubbing her temple. I believe you, Xavier. She leaned back in her chair. But things like this, they don't just disappear. Xavier felt his pulse pounding in his ears. So what are you saying? I'm saying... She paused, choosing her words carefully. You need to be smart about this. Her voice dropped lower. If someone wants you gone, they're not going to stop here. The weight of her words settled between them. Xavier sat back, staring at the ceiling for a long moment. He had two choices. He could back down, or he could fight back. And he had a feeling that if he chose the second, he had no idea just how far things were about to go. Xavier sat in his office, the overhead light casting a dim glow over the desk cluttered with papers and his laptop screen still open to the complaint email. He had spent years building his career, dedicating himself to his students, to his field. And now, a privileged group of students had decided they could erase him with a few well-placed lies and a smear campaign. For a moment, he simply stared at the screen, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. The old instinct to keep his head down, to wait for it to pass, to trust the system, itched at the back of his mind. But then he thought about the red words scrawled across his door, the laughter in his classroom, the smug look on Blake's face. They wanted him to leave. They wanted him to be afraid. And that was exactly why he wasn't going anywhere. He wouldn't fight this in silence. He wouldn't let them control the narrative. If they wanted this to be public, then public it would be. He reached for his phone, his heartbeat steadying as he opened the camera. He hit record. This is what happens, he began, his voice level, when you challenge the system. The words came naturally, not scripted, not rehearsed, just the truth. He laid it all out. The unedited videos from his lectures, the yawning prank, the speaker hack, the moment Blake accused him of being unqualified. The screenshot of his vandalized door, the email accusing him of bias, the false complaint that had been filed against him. He didn't speculate. He didn't call names. He simply presented the facts. And when he finished, he let the evidence speak for itself. This isn't about me, he said in closing, his gaze steady. It's about what happens when someone doesn't fit the mold of what people expect. It's about power, about control, about who gets to decide who belongs. He let a small pause hang in the air before adding the final words. Respect isn't given. It's earned. And sometimes it's taken. With one final breath, he clicked upload. Then he waited. It didn't take long. By the time the sun rose the next morning, his phone was vibrating nonstop. He reached for it, blinking away exhaustion as he checked the notifications. 250,000 views. His inbox was flooded. Some messages were supportive. Students from other universities sharing their own experiences of bias and mistreatment. Others were vicious, calling him weak, a fraud, someone who couldn't handle a little pushback. And then there was one email that stood out. Subject, urgent. University response required. It was from Dr. Ellen Wright. Xavier, please come to my office immediately. We have a situation. He was already reaching for his coat before he finished reading. As he walked across campus, he felt it, the shift. Students whispered as he passed, some looking away, others meeting his gaze with something closer to respect. Some nodded. A few even murmured apologies under their breath. And then, near the entrance to the administration building, he saw him. Blake Holloway, standing with his arms crossed, watching. For the first time since this started, he wasn't smirking. Xavier didn't stop. He pushed open Dr. Wright's office door without knocking. She was already at her desk, phone in hand, stress etched across her features. Shut the door, she said. He did. She exhaled. Your video is everywhere. I know. She turned her monitor around. Trending hashtags, news headlines, tweets from journalists, alumni, even other professors from across the country. Hashtag stand with Coleman. She pinched the bridge of her nose. The university board wants this handled quietly, but Xavier, this isn't just an internal issue anymore. Journalists are calling. Parents are calling. He blinked. Journalists? Yes. Your story hit Twitter last night, and there's already a demand for an investigation. Not just into your situation, but into the entire culture at this university. For a moment, Xavier just stared at the screen. He had wanted to clear his name, but now, Now it was bigger than him. Dr. Wright leaned forward. "The administration has no choice but to act," she said. "There will be a meeting. Official disciplinary hearings." Xavier folded his arms. "For who?" Her lips pressed together. "For the students involved." By lunchtime, the university had released a statement. It was carefully worded, corporate talk about reviewing concerns and upholding campus integrity. But the most important line was buried in the middle. "A formal inquiry will be launched into reports of misconduct within the student body." That was the moment the ground shifted. Blake Holloway wasn't laughing anymore, but he wasn't going down quietly either. That afternoon, Xavier's phone buzzed with a text from Olivia Tran. "They're waiting for you outside the student center. Be careful." Xavier didn't need to ask who they were. When he stepped onto the quad, the crowd was already forming. Students, some holding up their phones, recording, others whispering. And in the center of it all, standing tall, was Blake Holloway. His usual arrogance had sharpened into something nastier. Xavier met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "Something you need, Mr. Holloway?" Blake let out a mocking laugh, shaking his head. "Oh, so now you want to act like the big man?" Xavier didn't respond. He let the silence stretch. Blake's smirk wavered. "You're a joke, you know that?" Blake sneered. "A bunch of nobodies online think you're some kind of hero, but we all know the truth. You're just another professor who can't handle a little criticism." Xavier studied him for a long moment. "Criticism?" His voice was calm, cutting. "Is that what you call hacking my slides? Vandalizing my office? Filing a false complaint against me?" Blake scoffed. "Oh, come on. You really think anyone believes that? You're just playing the victim because you know you don't belong here." The crowd murmured, some in agreement, some shifting uncomfortably. Xavier exhaled slowly. Then, in a voice measured and steady, he asked, "Do you know why this has escalated the way it has?" Blake frowned. "What? Why this isn't just some private disagreement anymore? Why people are talking about this across the country?" Blake rolled his eyes. "Because you made a spectacle out of nothing." Xavier shook his head. "No," he said. "It's because people recognize what's happening, and they know it's bigger than just you and me." The crowd stilled. Xavier took a step closer. His voice stayed even, but there was an edge now. "You thought you could humiliate me, that if you push hard enough, I'd break, that I'd pack up and leave quietly." He let the words sink in. "But I didn't. And now, you don't know what to do." Blake's fists clenched at his sides. He opened his mouth to throw one last insult, one last jab. But then he hesitated, because he knew he had lost. The official announcement came early Monday morning. A formal investigation had been launched. The university's statement was carefully worded, filled with phrases about upholding campus integrity and ensuring a fair academic environment. But the real message was clear. This wasn't going to be swept under the rug. The names weren't listed, but everyone knew. Blake Holloway, his group. For the first time since this all began, they weren't the ones in control. By noon, the news had spread across campus. The hushed whispers in the hallways, the stolen glances, the way some students couldn't quite meet Xavier's eyes anymore. It all told him the same thing. The tides had turned. In his inbox, the emails were different now. Some were from students he had never even spoken to. "Dr. Coleman, I should have said something sooner. I'm sorry. I was in your class last year. I saw what they did. I didn't do anything. And now I regret it. I never realized how much power some students think they have over their professors. Thank you for standing up for yourself." Xavier read each one carefully, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Some messages he responded to. Others he simply sat with for a moment before moving on. He wasn't sure if winning was the right word for what had happened. But what he did know was this: something had shifted. The silence of complicity had broken. People were paying attention now. That afternoon, Xavier walked in a lecture hall, B203. For the first time in weeks, the air felt different. No whispers, no stolen glances, no laughter waiting to explode at his expense. Just students, sitting at their desks, waiting for class to begin. As he walked to the podium, a few students gave him nods of acknowledgement, small but meaningful. Olivia Tran sat near the front, notebook open, ready. Even some of the students who had once mocked him now sat quietly. their expressions unreadable. Xavier set his laptop down, looking out at them. He could feel it, the weight of everything that had happened still lingering in the room. But it wasn't the same. This wasn't a test anymore. This wasn't about power plays or control. It was about what they were here to do. Xavier exhaled, then smiled. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "Let's get back to learning." And this time, everyone listened. Respect is not given. It is earned. And sometimes, when people try to take it from you, you have to fight for it. Xavier Coleman didn't walk into that university looking for a fight. He didn't come to Stanford Heights to prove himself to anyone. He came to teach, to challenge students, to spark conversations that mattered. But the world doesn't always let you exist on your own terms. Sometimes, it decides you don't belong before you've even said a word. And sometimes, it will do everything in its power to push you out. What happened to Xavier wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about Blake Holloway or a classroom full of students or a university trying to protect its own image. It was about something bigger. It was about who gets to be respected, who gets to stand at the front of the room, who gets to speak and be heard without having to fight for every word. But Xavier made a choice. He chose to stand his ground. And because he did, people woke up. Some saw themselves in him. Some saw themselves in his silence. In all the times they let things slide, let injustices go unanswered because it was easier that way. And some, they saw themselves in Blake Holloway, in the way power is wielded without consequence. Until one day, someone decides enough is enough. The truth is, this isn't just a story about a professor who was bullied. It's a story about resistance, about refusing to back down, about what happens when you finally push back, and the world has no choice but to listen. So now ask yourself, if you were in Xavier's place, what would you have done? Would you have walked away? Or would you have fought back? Because sometimes the only way to earn respect is to demand it. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if this story resonated with you, share it. Because the more people who hear it, the harder it becomes to ignore. If this story made you think, don't just scroll away. Take action. Like this video to help spread awareness. Share it with your friends and family, because conversations spark change. Comment below and tell us your thoughts. Have you ever witnessed an abuse of power? Let's talk about it. Follow our channel for more powerful real-life stories. And turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Change starts with awareness. Awareness starts with you. Be part of the movement.